The seventh interview is entitled, You Can't Just Depend Upon Intercultural Communication, and features Edward Hall, professor of Northwestern University, and author of The Silent Language.
20 years, I think, have passed since you wrote The Silent Language, and I think it's almost 12 or 13 years since the Japanese rendition of The Silent Language appeared. Do you think that during the past 20 years, or perhaps during the last 12 years or so here in Japan, great strides have been made in intercultural understanding or cross-cultural communication?
When I wrote that book, there was no such thing as a subject of intercultural communication.
Right.
Now, 20 years later, we find that this has become a sort of a buzzword, and that people are beginning to appreciate the subject of and the importance of intercultural communication. That this is something that is extraordinarily vital, and that if you don't appreciate it, you can't really perform in government or in business, or if you perform it will be badly.
Right. In these days of shrinkage of space or annihilation of distance, cross-cultural contacts are bound to increase. But I'm afraid that as cross-cultural contacts increase, so may increase cross-cultural conflicts or frictions. Do you think that we are prepared to have a greater amount of intercultural contacts without running the risk of these cross-cultural contacts leading to more conflicts?
I may be appearing to speak against myself, but I really am not. But one of the advantages of this trip, where I started with a talk in Germany and then spent some time in southern France and then in Greece and in Hong Kong, has been an opportunity to see the world at first hand on an intimate basis. And it seems that some things have happened now that are independent of intercultural communication, that are very important and which we must not lose sight of. One of them is that the common man has more money. And because he has more money, he is not as tense as he was in the past.
I see.
And because he's not as tense as he was in the past, he tends to be a little more appreciative of, or maybe a little less hard on his fellow men. So that along with intercultural communication, I think that one constantly has to keep in mind that there are other factors that are very strongly at work in the process. In other words, you can't just depend upon intercultural communication to do the job for you. For instance, if you're selling a product that is a bad product, good intercultural communication is not going to sell it for you.
You're right.
And this is important. Now, on the other side, there are political things that when people are held down, it doesn't matter how nice you are to them. If they're held down, that nothing is going to erase that fact. Now, you still have to know how to speak to people in their own language.
Yes.
I mean, it's helpful to be able to speak to people in their own language. But since everybody in the world cannot learn everybody else's language, I think the most important thing now is to know that sometimes we don't understand each other, and not to go away. In other words, to stay, just not to run away, just simply because someone is not treating us the way we expect to be treated. And that's a very important rule, is just to hold your ground and to not let him feel that he has alienated you. And this is a sort of a general rule for everybody. Is in the United States we say, hang in there.
So you mean to say that intercultural communication is not necessarily a panacea for the ills that may arise from time to time in cross-cultural contacts. But still, nevertheless, you obviously maintain that a better acquaintance with intercultural communication as a discipline will turn out to be an asset. Now, let me ask you a question about a little bit different topic. Some of the Japanese companies, I understand, have been extremely successful in employing their traditionally Japanese methods and tools of management in the United States. We thought perhaps that the American workers might resent being exposed to the peculiarly and uniquely Japanese methods of management practice and so on. Now, any comments that you'd like to make along these lines?
Yes, I don't know whether it was Sony or another case, but I did read about it because the Japanese reputation in the United States for its products has in part to do with the quality of the products and the very high standards of quality control. Our quality control in the United States has slipped somewhat. So that in order to get to quality, in this case, why a Japanese quality control person was standing behind every American worker, one for one. Now, we will normally do our quality control on a sample basis, maybe 2 or 3% or 5% or something else like that, which saves money on quality control, but doesn't save money in the long run. The discovery was that first you have to compliment Japanese management for being willing to spend the money to put one quality control person for every worker, which was something American management would never do. And this is a matter of management philosophy. I think the workers could see in this case that the Japanese management was really serious about quality. And see, this is what we call, this is an example of nonverbal communication, because the presence of those quality control supervisors was a very strong communication to the American workers.
Nonverbal communication.
Yes, that quality means is very important, that the management is willing to spend all of that money to get that kind of results. So obviously the Americans aren't stupid. You know, they say, well, I mean, if they're willing to spend this kind of money and go to this kind of effort, then this must be important to them. And if it's important to them, it's got to be important to us. Now, anyone who, unless he's a very disturbed human being, most people like to do a good job. So in this case, see, the management methods have been effective, very effective on a very deeply personal basis, almost transcending the cultural one.
Another case which has occurred to me is related to the practice of doing physical exercises each morning. American workers of Japanese corporations in the United States are required to do some physical exercises before work every morning. And at first, they thought, the Japanese management thought that that would be resisted very vigorously by the American workers, but the American workers proved to like it. Now, how would you explain a situation like this?
I have several things that come to my mind all at once. One was that we used to do our physical exercises in camp as children. And we're used to that, doing the exercises, and in school also. But the other is that in the United States, it's only the big shots that were allowed to exercise. And, I mean, they can have their exercise cycle in their office, or they can take time off to do exercises.
For physical fitness.
Yeah, but the workers are not encouraged. So this exercise shows that, again, you see that you're concerned over the health of your workers, and you're willing to pay them to go out there and to exercise their bodies, which they know is good for them. So it isn't just the imposition of a corporate will on the person. The person says, well, they think enough about me to care about how my health. So
this episode may be construed as an example in egalitarianism, maybe.
Well, it's maybe it could be it's concern, it's management concern over the welfare of the people who are working.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
I think it's fascinating.
My final question. Of course, in the silent language, you emphasize the importance of appreciating the role that is played by nonverbal communication. Time talks and space speaks. Were the titles of two chapters in the book. And here in Japan, traditionally, we have always held verbal communication or verbalization in very low esteem, while we have always held reticence or taciturnity in very high esteem, and consequently we have developed all sorts of all forms of nonverbal communication, one of which is called harage. The word-for-word translation of that term goes something like the art of the belly, which means gut communication, nonverbal communication. And also we have said the Japanese language abounds with such proverbs, for instance, as the eyes are more eloquent than the mouth, or sickness enters the mouth and misfortune comes out of the same place. The tongue is to be more feared than the sword, and things of that sort, emphasizing the virtue of nonverbal communication or nonverbal understanding. However, I wonder if this sort of peculiarly Japanese form of communication can be translatable as we have to engage in more and more cross-cultural communication. Now, any comments along these lines?
Well, what you have said is very important, and it's a complicated answer, because there are some places, for instance, like in Greece, where the eyes really are used. And in the United States, we don't use the eyes anywhere nearly as much as they do in some other places where you don't look at people at all. But the main topic of nonverbal communication is a much older system. In other words, it comes from a different part of the brain, and it's one that's more suffused with emotion and with feeling, and interestingly enough, with loyalty.
I see.
So that a good nonverbal communication is more linked with loyalty than it is with logic. Now, logic is a Western system. It's not, and it's one that which the Japanese tend to mistrust, because you can prove anything with logic. But you are talking, when you talk only with on this gut level as we talk, then you see you are much more likely to know what is really going to happen and whether you can depend upon the other person or not.